So my first question for you is just for me, what is M&A? What does that mean? What does that translate to?
But it's interesting because, I'll get into this a little bit more throughout this discussion around capital in the mining sector, but we've increasingly seen M&A really expand into take just almost an infinite way, shape, and form of how it's structured, from different partnerships amongst industry peers or partnerships amongst customers and suppliers. So it's really in my mind, a broadening concept that's that's really diversifying quite rapidly in how companies approach these what's traditionally just been one company buying another or two companies joining forces.
So what are the big concerns today?
Big concerns today.
If you were to sort of give us your top 5, top 10 concerns.
There's a lot of concerns. And I do have a slide somewhere in the deck here, but this is this is a report that EY puts out every year. It's actually the 15th year we've done this. And historically, we've titled it our top 10 risks in mining report. And I love the theme that you've kind of woven throughout your topic, and a lot of what I've heard today is around optimism, right? And we had a similar kind of realization a few years back that it's really not, sure, you can perceive these as risks, but you can also perceive them as opportunities from a much more opportunistic lens. So this is a report that like I said, we survey mining executives globally every year, and these are the items that are top of mind for them. So to no surprise, things like ESG and decarbonization and license to operate, I kind of bucket those together to a certain degree, but those very much dominate the list in our most recent report. We'll get into some of those, I'm sure, in this discussion here. But how do you manage water rights and not deplete that valuable resource in countries like Chile? And how do you track scope 1, 2, 3 emissions? When you look at the downstream consumers of these minerals, take the automotive industry, for example. Today and going into the future, I anticipate there's a day where GM or Ford or Volkswagen, truly wants to be able to trace the steel, the nickel, the cobalt, whatever's going into that vehicle, all the way back to the mouth of the mine, so that they can track their emissions all throughout the value chain. And that's really something that would be enabled through the ability to collect and analyze data. And then some other risks on here, again, I won't read them all, but a couple more I'd highlight is really around workforce. We talked a lot about that. Yep. How do you incentivize and bring make the mining industry attractive to the current generations coming out of school. And then lastly, capital, right? Yeah, that, like I was touching on a little bit here, but the mechanisms for how things are being funded and M&A transactions are really evolving as the future goes on.
So what does ESG mean? What are people looking for when they come to you and ask you to evaluate ESG?
Any number of things, because it's, ESG has obviously become a very hot topic in just the world in the last number of years, but in mining in particular, I think it takes a much deeper, no pun intended, meaning, because there's such a bigger element to it. So what we often assist clients with is one, how do you articulate your ESG strategy? How do you take your plans, your current KPIs, and how do you formulate and communicate that strategy to investors as, this is where I am today, this is where I want to go, and this is how it will add value to my company for all stakeholders. That's probably the biggest way that we advise clients on ESG.
So when you talk with companies about innovation and technology, what are the main challenges to implementing those technologies for companies?
Yeah, I think the main challenges that we see are, like anything, there's a lot of challenges, but one is, and it ties back to the workforce comment, but how do you, when you take an industry that still has very much elements of being a very manual business from an operational standpoint, how do you reskill that workforce to one, be able to operate in this new technological environment, but two, how do you get them to buy into it? So, it's all well and good if you implement some new maintenance tracking system, but I've been on mine tours before where we're evaluating a company during an acquisition, and they say, we track these KPIs in the system, and then you go talk to someone and, doing maintenance on haul trucks, and they have their side little handwritten spreadsheet where they're tracking it. So a big challenge that we often see is just getting everyone to really buy in and trust the technology and trust that it will, solve those issues. Another risk that we see, or another area we see is how do you sorry, I'm losing my train of thought for a second here, but how do you communicate the value of that investment in technology to your investors? So when oftentimes these programs are very capital intensive, and it's being able to really understand the return on investment that can be possible through that if you are successful, and communicate that to your investors and stakeholders.
So when we talk about capital, patient capital, how do you advise your clients through the lens of 10 years, 15 years, 20 years to get a project up and running?
Yeah, that's the age-old question, especially with all the themes you talked about earlier with the permitting process. But really, I think it's nothing. It's not necessarily a new risk, I guess, for the mining industry. It's always something that is. If you think about the process from exploration to permitting to construction, yes, it takes a very long time, but it's never been snap of the fingers and you're pulling minerals out of the ground. So, we do find that generally investors are, their understanding of that time constraint and what that means. The way we really advise investors on that is around how do you properly account for that risk in your investment thesis. So whether it be taking the geological reports and adding in risk factors for the type of mineral, the geography that it sits in, the stage of development it's in, but it's really saying that that this is just a natural reality of the sector. But how do you properly account for and value and risk adjust those factors in your investment decisions?
So if you think about the companies that you have advised, are there any common characteristics of the companies that get it right?
Yeah, I think there are. I think there's two big things that I think companies get right in this aspect, and one is companies, and I think about a large iron ore miner in particular, but companies who take a very holistic approach to their business problem and really keep that as the center and focus of what they're trying to do from an innovation standpoint. Those are the companies that tend to really have success in these large transformational projects. If you're looking at things in a very siloed fashion, you're only looking at processing or you're only looking at exploration, those are the ones that we tended to see not be as successful. But when you're looking at it from exploration, mining, processing, rail transportation, port, shipping, if you really look at it end to end and keep that as an overarching strategic focus, that has been a key differentiator of success. And then the other one I would mention is just leaders and companies who very much have trust and enablement in their people. I think is another one that is a key for success. Leaders that truly trust their team members, their team leaders that are executing these projects tend to do very well. And I think it goes back to some of the comments on startups that you guys were having on the last panel. Look, if you take a mature mining company, you can't change the fact that they're not a startup, right? But if you think about the elements of a startup that younger generations like, the ability to make a meaningful impact and be trusted with big decisions and be put in areas of responsibility that are a little out of their comfort zone. You can bring those kind of elements into big projects, and that really, and from what we've seen, will motivate people to buy in and make those projects successful, or give them a better chance of being successful.
So on the flip side of that, are there any common characteristics of mistakes that companies have made that you could use without naming companies? Possibly some examples of things not to do.
I think it's more or less just the inverse of what I just said. You know, it's companies that don't take a very holistic approach to what they're doing. You know, if they very much operate in silos, that is probably the number one area where we've seen things not work out very well. And I think the other key area, you know, on a similar thought, is when you don't have leadership buy-in and a really a top-down, you know, leading by example of putting your money where your mouth is on making something go forward, you know, that again tends to lead to problems.
And startups, most of the people that work for them don't want to be micromanaged.
Correct. Exactly. Right. Yeah. That's exactly
they want
right.
infinite degrees of freedom to do what they want to do.
Yeah. And the other thing that I was thinking about, because I mentioned that workforce is one of our risks, and this made me think of it during your last panel, is I think the other element from attracting talent that is a big opportunity that the companies could think through, and we've seen success in, is really tying business success to how team members are compensated. I think is another big opportunity to attract kind of the more the younger generations of talent that are looking for that kind of appetite, because that's part of the draw of working in a startup, right? Is you oftentimes have some level of equity, and if that startup does well, then you share in the success. So finding ways to enable your workforce to share in the success of these projects has been another success factor that again kind of ties back to workforce and making that happen.
So you've visited lots of places in lots of parts of the world. When you think about advising companies where the decision makers come from one type of culture and now they are working with people from other cultures, do you see any challenges there that are challenges being faced?
Yeah.
And advice you have to overcome them?
Absolutely. I mean, it's no secret, right, that certain jurisdictions of the world are more favorable to mining than others. There's certain jurisdictions have more challenges than others. It's why you see some bigger M&A deals recently. I think of something like the Newmont-Newcrest deal that was announced a month or so ago. A lot of those mines that are being acquired are in places like Canada and Australia, and that are what I would consider fairly supportive mining jurisdictions. So I do think that there definitely is differences in cultures and appetite for the industry. But I think the way I think ultimately many of these things, I keep coming back to workforce and people, but I think a lot of it really just comes back to, at the end of the day, you are a human from one country working with a human in another country. So the ability to be present, listen to their life challenges, what makes them come to work every day to support their family, the same reason you're going to work today to support your family, or what have you. Being able to empathize and understand those personal relationships, I think is that's key in really any company to developing a strong culture.
I think I often think of that as when you have conversations with people, listen with the intent to understand them, rather than simply listen with the intent to reply.
Yeah.
And that goes a long way.
Yeah.
When we think about social license to operate, what are mining companies doing now to innovate and to work with local community stakeholders to get that social license?
Yeah, it's a great question, and this is something that we talk with clients about quite often, and this concept of license to operate has been in our risk report at varying levels for many years. But it's things that the mining industry has been doing for a long time. If you're putting a water treatment plant on your mine site, have that water treatment plant also support the indigenous town or the people in the surrounding areas. Same thing with in today's world, mining companies that are contemplating renewable energy investments to support their mine site, having those renewable energy sources also support the cities and the populations that are surrounding them. So I think it's very much the old saying of, actions are louder than words, right? You can say we support you all you want to the communities around you, but your actions, making concrete investments in schools and water and power and infrastructure and improving the way of life, I think is a very concrete way of showing that we are truly invested in your community for the long run. And I think what mining companies can continue to do is really one, do a good job of articulating that and the value that it brings, but even from just a pure financial stakeholder standpoint, there is a indirect return on investment there, because the more you bring support to the community around you, the more likely they are to not put up opposition to permitting needs in the future. The more that the children who come up in those communities will be supportive of your operation and looking to one day work in your operation and keep that going for a number of years. So I do think there's also just a very real financial benefit and benefit to financial stakeholders through those types of projects.
And do you think mining companies are getting that right? Do you think they understand it for the right reasons rather than simply through the lens of getting a permit?
I do. I think like many things, they've probably always understood it. They've always tried to do the right thing to a certain degree, but I think they're realizing more and more that as time goes on, that investment and that buy-in to your community is just it's something that's ever increasing. And if you want to be successful, it's something that you simply have to do. And I think I do still come back to it's a good business decision for both sides, because the communities benefit from the investments that are being made, and the mining companies benefit because that is the next generation of workforce coming up through those schools and trade programs and innovation centers and things like that they have developed in those communities.
And we talked earlier about how R&D, which used to primarily be done by the big mining companies, now that is largely being done by small to mid-sized companies, lots of startups. Do you see mining companies increasingly turning to people on the outside to help them with social license to operate? As somebody who was trained as a geologist and a chemist, I was never trained in how to work directly with local community stakeholders.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think and it's not just the mining industry. It's a lot of different industries that you at the end of the day you have a core competency. In this case, your core competency is the exploration, extraction, processing of minerals. So even things like power generation on site, we will often see mining companies outsourcing that, or refuse disposal. I'm trying to think of some other examples, but at the end of the day, things such as maintaining a license to operate it's not a direct mining activity, right? It's to your point, it's not what you're trained to do.
So you can bring experts in to help you with that.
Yeah.
When you think about the labor shortage across the mining industry,
yeah,
where do you think there are the sort of easiest opportunities for the industry to make gains there?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's I think you had some great slides and discussion on it earlier, but I think I'd go back to the comment I made on the startup side of things. I think finding ways to more creatively incentivize and compensate your workforce, kind of gives it more of a same thing with my job, and I'm sure your job, many people's jobs, right? If all of a sudden you have some sort of equity or some sort of incentive that kicks in when you achieve some metric, then that's going to make it a more attractive place to work. I think about all this technology being developed around autonomy and remote operations. The simulator we saw in the other room. The thought of a 20-something-year-old flying in, flying out to a remote area, living there for 2 weeks on, 1 week off, is, as we've seen, is not that attractive. But if I can live in downtown Toronto and commute to an office 20 minutes away and sit in a simulator and drive that same equipment, then that that makes that much more attractive. And it's a multi-beneficial concept because you're reducing operating costs. You're not flying someone there and back and putting them up for 2 weeks in your mining camp. And it's a huge safety thing. It's one less person underground. So I think those are huge opportunities there to make the profession more attractive to that generation.
So where do you see deals being struck, capital being invested in the next 5 years? Are there any hot spots?
Yeah, battery, or I shouldn't say battery, electrification. We're seeing just a very big influx of capital in anything and everything tied to critical minerals and the electrification supply chain. And we're seeing very, traditionally you just have a mining company with, have their own funding mechanisms to develop and operate properties. But, we're seeing more and more things like Ford's investment in a nickel refinery in Indonesia, and GM investing in Thacker Pass and a lithium project out in Nevada. So I think we're going to see more and more deals like that where you have the downstream consumers wanting to directly invest, secure supply, secure offtake, because they're having kind of a moment of realization of we need to make, if we're going to meet these goals for electrification of our product, we need to have the minerals to do that, and you can't just snap your fingers and make them show up. It's a much more complicated process than that.
What are the challenges advising companies in countries where political cycles often have an impact on policy?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I try to stay away from politics. I think you just have to really see everything as an opportunity and a much longer term play. You can't change the cards you're dealt. It's that. If all of a sudden a regime changes or a government changes from one side to the other, then there's nothing you can do about it. So all you can do, and I think that's why the concept of maintaining your license to operate and really being a good steward to the communities around you is as important as ever, because when a government does shift from a party or an administration that's more friendly to mining to less friendly to mining, for example, having a community behind you that says, oh wait, this company is very important to our town, our community, our what have you, our employment, it makes it that much more difficult for that government to put a stop or to your operations or take a higher royalty rate or what have you.
So what makes you optimistic?
What makes me optimistic?
If we think about a world where electrification becomes the norm 10, 20, 30 years from now, thinking through the lens of the companies that you engage with and what seems to be almost limitless capital, looking for safe bets, what makes you optimistic?
I think it's kind of what you said earlier. I mean, at the end of the day, I just don't think we have a choice, right? I mean, there's someone out there, there are brilliant minds out there who will take this problem and figure it out. I think you talk about your kids who are in their kind of late high school, early college years, really trying to figure out what they want to do to impact the world. I have a 1-year-old, so he's not quite there yet, but that's what makes me optimistic, is just what are those next generations going to do to solve these problems? Because I think, to your point, I mean, there's no choice. They're going to have to. Someone will figure it out, and that's kind of the beauty of innovation, is you have a lot of people trying, and something's got to hit.
Well, Bryan, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Yeah.